On a dark, rainy night, David, a poor shoemaker with a gentle heart, spotted a small boy shivering outside his wooden cabin. Without a second thought, he welcomed the lost child inside, gave him shelter, and stitched him a pair of shoes to replace the ones lost in the mud. The next morning, as he opened the cabin door, he froze, startled by the sight before him: a sleek black car parked outside, and a wealthy man stepping out with purpose, his eyes fixed on the boy inside. Life was about to surprise David in the most unexpected way. Hello everyone, welcome to Narrative Whispers. Today I'm going to share another heartwarming story, so let's dive into it. The rain came down hard that night, pounding against the roof of David's wooden cabin. The cabin sat at the end of a muddy road, surrounded by tall trees that swayed in the wind. Inside, David, a poor shoemaker, worked at a rickety table under the glow of a single lamp. His hands moved slowly, stitching a patch onto an old boot. He didn't have a shop in town, couldn't afford one, so this cabin was everything. His home, his work, his life. The walls were worn, and the air smelled of leather and damp wood, but it was his. Money was tight, and most days he barely scraped by, but David kept going. He had to. He paused for a moment, listening to the storm outside. The rain made everything feel lonelier than usual. David was used to quiet nights, but tonight the emptiness weighed on him. As he reached for another piece of thread, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement outside the window. He squinted through the glass, blurry with rain, and saw a small figure standing in the dark. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, soaked and shivering. David's stomach dropped. What was a kid doing out there? He got up quickly, his chair scraping the floor, and opened the door. The wind rushed in, cold and wet. "Hey, little one," he called over the noise of the rain. The boy turned, his face pale and scared. His feet, David noticed right away, were bare, covered in mud. "You all right?" David asked, stepping out onto the porch. The boy didn't answer, just stared with big, nervous eyes. "Come here, come inside," David said, his voice soft but firm. He waved the boy toward the cabin. "You can't stay out in this mess." The boy hesitated, glancing around like he might run off. David kept the door wide open, showing he meant no harm. "I ain't gonna hurt you. Just want you to warm up." Finally, the boy took a shaky step forward and slipped inside, dripping water onto the wooden floor. David shut the door behind him and grabbed an old blanket from a chair. "Here, wrap this around you," he said, handing it over. The boy took it, pulling it tight around his shoulders. He was small, smaller than David had first thought, and his teeth chattered as he stood there. David pointed to the fireplace where a weak fire flickered. "Go sit there. I'll get you something." The boy nodded and shuffled over, curling up close to the heat. David went to his kitchen corner. He didn't have much, just half a loaf of bread and some butter, but it was enough. He cut a slice, spread butter on it, and gave it to the boy. "What's your name?" he asked, kneeling down. "Tommy," the boy whispered, taking the bread. "Tommy, I'm David. Why were you out there with no shoes?" David kept his voice soft. Tommy chewed slowly. "I was playing. Then it got dark and rained. I got lost and my shoes got stuck in the mud." He looked down, embarrassed. David frowned. Poor kid, lost in a storm. "You're safe now," he said. "Stay here tonight. It's too bad out there." He glanced at Tommy's red, cold feet. His clothes weren't torn, just dirty with rain and mud clinging to his small frame. "We'll sort it out tomorrow." Tommy nodded, finishing his bread. David stood up, thinking. He didn't lock the door that night. He never did, really, but especially not now. If Tommy wanted to leave, he could. David didn't want the boy to feel trapped, like some prisoner. He'd been on his own too long to force anyone into anything. "There's a cot over there," he told Tommy, pointing to a corner. "You can sleep when you're ready." Tommy climbed onto the cot, still wrapped in the blanket, and was out in minutes. But David didn't sleep. He sat back at his table, staring at Tommy's little feet sticking out from the blanket. No shoes. Lost in the rain. Something about it tugged at him hard. He got up, pulled out a scrap of leather from his box of supplies, and started working. His hands moved on their own, cutting, stitching, shaping. He'd make Tommy a pair of shoes. Simple ones, nothing fancy, but warm and tough. The night stretched on, the rain drumming outside, but David kept going, lost in the rhythm of it. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle by morning, leaving the air cool and heavy with the smell of wet earth. David stood on the porch of his cabin, his hands rough and tired from the night's work. "Well, that's done," he muttered to himself, flexing his cramped fingers. The little shoes, small, sturdy, and patched together from his best scraps, sat by Tommy's cot inside. He'd finished them just as the first light broke through the trees, his eyes burning but his chest warm with something he couldn't quite name. "Kid's gonna need these," he said under his breath, picturing Tommy's bare feet again, red and muddy from the storm. He hadn't slept, hadn't even tried. Every time he thought about resting, that image pulled him back to his table. The boy deserved better than that. David rubbed his neck, stiff from hunching over, and took a deep breath. "Time to figure you out, little man," he murmured, glancing back toward the cabin. Today he'd find out where Tommy belonged. Inside, Tommy stirred on the cot, the old blanket slipping off his shoulder as he blinked awake. His hair was a mess, sticking up in clumps where the rain had dried it overnight. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and then froze when he saw the shoes. They were simple, nothing fancy, just brown leather with tight stitches, but Tommy's face broke into a pure smile. "These are for me? Really?" he asked, looking up at David with wide, sparkling eyes. "Those are yours," David said from the doorway, his voice gruff but kind. Tommy let out a little whoop, kicking off the blanket to slip them on fast. "They're so nice," he said. He couldn't stop smiling, and it made the whole room feel lighter. David watched him for a moment, hands in his pockets. "You sleep, okay?" he asked. Tommy nodded, as yes. "Good," David said. "We'll head into town today. See if we can find your folks." He didn't have much food left, just a crust of bread and a little tea, but he boiled some water over the fire and split what he had with Tommy. The boy ate fast, like he hadn't had a real meal in a while. David wondered how long he'd been out there, lost in the rain. "Where's home, Tommy?" He tried again, casual-like, but Tommy just shrugged. "Somewhere," he mumbled, and that was all David got. The muddy road stretched out ahead as they left the cabin, Tommy's new shoes squishing in the wet dirt. David walked slow, letting the boy keep up. He didn't lock the door behind them, never did, really. What was there to steal? A few old tools and a pile of leather scraps. Tommy's clothes were still damp and streaked with mud, but he looked a little less lost now, those shoes giving him a bit of bounce in his step. The town was a couple miles off, a small cluster of shops and houses nestled between the hills. David didn't go there much. Folks knew him as the shoemaker who lived out on the edge, but he wasn't one for chatting or trading favors. Today, though, he had a reason. He figured someone might know Tommy or at least point them toward whoever was missing a kid. The boy stayed close as they walked, his eyes darting around at the trees and the puddles. "You ever been down this road before?" David asked. Tommy shook his head. "Don't think so," he said softly. David nodded, keeping his thoughts to himself. Lost, then. Really lost. They'd been walking for hours, roaming the muddy paths and trails around the town, but David couldn't find anyone who knew Tommy or his parents. He'd asked at the general store, the blacksmiths, even knocked on a few doors. Nothing. "You sure you don't remember anything, kid?" he'd said more than once, and Tommy just shook his head, kicking at the dirt with his new shoes. David's hope was fading fast. The boy's folks either weren't around or didn't care, and the thought weighed on him. By late afternoon, tired and out of ideas, he turned them back toward the cabin. "Guess it's just us for now," he sighed, trudging along with Tommy trailing behind. He felt helpless, his shoulders slumping as the trees closed in around them again. Then, out of nowhere, the sound of an engine broke the quiet. David turned, squinting, as a sleek black car rolled up the road behind them. It wasn't the kind of thing you saw out here, too shiny, too expensive. The tires splashed through the mud, slowing as it got closer. David stepped to the side, pulling Tommy with him, figuring it had passed by, but it didn't. Tommy's breath hitched. Before David could say a word, the boy yanked free of his grip and ran, straight toward the man. "Dad!" he yelled, his voice cracking with relief. He threw himself into the man's arms, burying his face in the fancy coat. The man dropped to one knee, hugging Tommy tight, his hands shaking a little. "Tommy," he said, rough and quiet, like he'd been holding that word in for too long. David stood there, hands still in his pockets, watching it unfold. The pieces clicked together fast. This wasn't just some lost kid. This was someone's son, someone big. The man looked up at David, standing now with Tommy clinging to his side. "You found him?" he asked, his voice steady, but thick with something heavy. Before David could answer, Tommy piped up, tugging at his dad's coat. "Dad, he's David, and he's really a nice guy. He cared about me and gave me food. He gave me shelter, Dad, and see—" He stuck out one foot, showing off the shoes. "Mine got lost in the mud, but he made these with his hands." His voice was full of pride, like David was some kind of hero. David shifted, uncomfortable with the attention, and shrugged. "He showed up at my cabin last night, soaked and shoeless," he said simply. The man's eyes flicked to the shoes, then back to David, taking it all in. "You made those?" he asked. David nodded. "Couldn't let him walk around barefoot." The man studied him for a moment like he was weighing something, then gave a short nod. "I owe you," he said, his tone firm but grateful. David scratched the back of his neck, feeling the weight of the man's words. "Owe me? Nah, it's nothing," he said, waving a hand like he could brush it off. Truth was, he didn't know what to make of this guy. Fancy car, fancy coat, and a kid who'd been wandering alone in the rain. The man straightened up, still holding Tommy's hand, and shook his head. "It's not nothing. You kept him safe when I couldn't." His voice cracked just a little, and David saw something raw flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe, or fear. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet, thick with cash. "Name's Richard," he said, flipping it open. "Richard Hale. I don't know how to thank you properly, but—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes drifting back to Tommy's shoes. He knelt down again, running a hand over the leather, inspecting the stitches. "Wait a minute," he said, almost to himself. "You made these from scratch? Last night?" David nodded, a little thrown by the intensity in Richard's gaze. "Yeah, just some scraps I had lying around, nothing special." Richard stood up slowly, shaking his head. "No, that's remarkable. Clean work, sturdy. I've been looking for someone with hands like yours for a long time." David blinked, unsure where this was going. "Hands like mine?" he asked, wiping them on his pants like they were something to hide. Richard nodded, his face lighting up with a kind of excitement David didn't expect. "I own a company, Hale Footwear, 20 factories, big operation. We make shoes, good ones, but it's all machines now. Fast, cheap. I've been trying to find a real shoemaker, someone who knows the craft, not just the business." Tommy bounced beside him, grinning. "See, Dad? I told you David's the best." Richard chuckled, ruffling his son's hair, but his eyes stayed on David. "He's right. This kind of talent, it's rare. Where'd you learn it?" David shrugged, feeling the spotlight in a way he wasn't used to. "Taught myself, mostly. Been fixing boots and making what I can since I was a kid. Ain't much else to do out here." He gestured vaguely toward the cabin, its weathered shape half hidden by the trees. Richard crossed his arms, still studying the shoes on Tommy's feet. "Self-taught, huh? That's even better. Look, I don't know what you're doing out here, but a skill like that shouldn't be stuck at the end of a muddy road." David shifted, uneasy. "It's my life," he said simply. "Keeps me going." But Richard wasn't deterred. "Maybe it could do more than that," he said, his tone thoughtful. The air felt charged now, like something bigger than a thank you was unfolding. Tommy tugged at his dad's sleeve. "Can David come work with you, Dad?" "He could make shoes for everybody." Richard laughed, a deep, warm sound that cut through the drizzle. "Slow down, champ. Let's not scare him off." He looked at David again, serious now. "But he's not wrong. I've been hunting for someone to bring back the handmade side of things, special orders, high-end stuff, the kind of work machines can't touch. You could do that, David. I'd make it worth your while. David's throat tightened. Worth his while? He'd never thought past scraping by, let alone working for a man like this. Richard stepped closer, his voice dropping like he was sharing a secret. Listen, I've got a place an hour from here. Big house, workshop attached. Been meaning to set it up for something real, not just another factory line. Come with us, just for a day. See what I'm talking about, no pressure. I don't know, he muttered. Got no head for big plans. I just make shoes. Richard smiled faintly. That's exactly why I need you. One day, that's all I'm asking. David rubbed his jaw, the idea spinning in his head. A workshop? A real one, not his rickety table and leaky roof? He'd never dreamed that big, couldn't afford to. But the way Richard talked, like David's hands were worth something, stuck with him. One day, he said finally, almost surprised by his own voice. Guess I can do that. Tommy let out a whoop, throwing his arms around David's legs. Yes, you're gonna love it. Richard clapped a hand on David's shoulder, firm and friendly. Good choice. Grab whatever you need from the cabin. We'll head out now. David nodded, still half dazed, and trudged back to pack a few tools and scraps, wondering what he'd just agreed to. David sat up front, his calloused hands resting awkward on his knees, while Richard drove with the ease of someone who owned the road. How many pairs you make in a week? Richard asked, glancing over. David thought about it. Depends. 2, maybe 3 if I've got the leather. Folks around here don't pay much. Richard nodded like that confirmed something. That's the trouble. Talent like yours, wasted on small change. My factories churn out thousands a day, but it's not the same. You could run a team, teach them how it's done, bring back the real stuff. David stared out the window, the words sinking in slow. A team? Him? They pulled up to a gated estate an hour later, the kind of place David had only seen in pictures. A huge house loomed ahead, white stone, tall windows, sprawled across green lawns that looked too perfect to be real. Tommy bolted out as soon as the car stopped, yelling, Mom, I'm back! A woman rushed from the front door, her face pale and tear-streaked, scooping him into her arms. Oh, Tommy, thank God, she sobbed, holding him tight. Richard climbed out, giving David a nod to follow. That's Claire, my wife, he said. She's been a mess since he disappeared. David trailed behind, feeling like an intruder in this world of wealth and worry, his muddy boots loud against the polished driveway. Come with me, David. I want to show you something. Before David could protest, Richard was steering him toward the car, motioning for him to get in. They drove a short distance, Tommy and Claire waving from the porch, and pulled up to a sprawling building just beyond the estate, a factory, its sign reading Hale Footwear. Richard led him inside, the hum of machines filling the air as they walked past rows of workers and stacks of shoes. This is one of my 20, Richard said, his voice cutting through the noise. Big operation fast, but it's missing heart. See those? He pointed to a conveyor belt of plain, mass-made boots. No soul in 'em, not like what you did for Tommy. He stopped, turning to David. I've been looking for a real shoemaker, someone with your talent, to run a team here. Special projects, handmade stuff. You'd have a workshop, people to train. What do you say? David stood there, the factory's noise buzzing around him like a living thing. Richard's words echoed in his head. Soul, talent, real shoemaker. Out in his cabin, he'd patched boots for pennies, never thinking it meant much beyond survival. But here, in this huge place, a man like Richard saw something different, something worth building on. You really think I could do this? David asked, voice quiet under the clatter. Richard nodded, steady as ever. I know you can. That's why I'm asking. The walk back to the car was quiet, Richard giving him space to think. David's mind churned like the machines they'd left behind. He pictured his cabin, the damp walls, the lonely nights, and then Tommy's grin when he'd slipped on those shoes, the way Richard had traced the stitches like they were art. Respect. That's what this was. Not just a job, but a place where his work mattered, where it wasn't just scraping by. "All right," he said finally, stopping by the car. "I'll do it. Managing, teaching, whatever you need." Richard broke into a wide smile, clapping him on the back. "That's the spirit. You won't regret it." Back in the car, the engine hummed soft as they rolled toward the estate. David stared out the window, the green blur of lawns streaking by. He thought about his hands, worn, steady, always just enough to get by, and how they'd led him here. Opportunity meeting kindness. That's what this was. A chance born from a rainy night, a pair of shoes, a kid's trust. A quiet smile tugged at his lips, warm and real. Beside him, Richard drove with a calm satisfaction, glancing over now and then. He'd given David something. Not charity, never that, but a role, a respect he'd carry without burden, repayment for sheltering his son when the storm came down. It felt right, for both of them. Thank you for listening to this story. If you like it, please do not forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story of Narrative Whispers.